From the Trump administration to the Biden administration, the U.S. government has been trying to rein in Huawei, which is China's preeminent tech company, and for a while it looks like they might be succeeding. But about a month ago, Huawei came out with a Mate 60 Pro smartphone, which is a highly advanced smartphone, not quite at the level of Apple's iPhone, but much stronger and using much more advanced chip-making technology than the U.S. was hoping China would have access to. And the reason that they were able to do that is because while the U.S. has ratcheted up its export controls and sanctions regime against China, there have been some gaping holes left by a lack of coordination with allies, in particular Japan and the Netherlands, that have allowed Huawei to catch up.
Take a step back. Remind us why so many, certainly the United States and other countries around the world, have been looking to rein in Huawei. Remind the world.
So the issue in this story is not really the smartphone. It's the semiconductor chip that powers the smartphone. And the fact that Huawei has been able to come up with such an advanced chip doesn't really matter in the phone world, but it matters a lot for military applications in particular. So the U.S. and its allies view this as a really serious national security issue. If the Chinese and Chinese state-backed companies are able to produce chips with artificial intelligence capabilities that can power highly advanced weapons technology, that poses a real threat to America and its allies.
So what is the Biden administration doing to try and combat this threat?
So the Biden administration released a round of export controls last October that basically tried to cut China off at the knees and say, you can only produce chips that are several generations behind the cutting edge. The problem is they announced those controls without getting the Japanese and the Dutch governments on board. And some of the most important companies in the semiconductor supply chain are located in Japan and the Netherlands. So China was able to stockpile that equipment, retool it to make more advanced chips than the U.S. thought they would be able to, and now produce this phone that's a generation ahead of where the U.S. wanted to keep them. And now the options for the Biden administration have significantly narrowed because Chinese have so much equipment, and the question is, can they produce it at scale?
Yeah. Are there any new policies that are going to change, given that they now see that, wow, Huawei's managed to do this?
So that's the big question in D.C. right now. As you can imagine, Republicans on Capitol Hill immediately blasted the Biden administration for being weak on China, saying that Huawei and the company SMIC that actually produced the chip in the phone are blatantly violating U.S. sanctions and export controls.
Well,
so the Commerce Department...
Sorry. No. Keep going.
So the Commerce Department is right now investigating Huawei's phone. And the question for them is, as they finalize the export controls announced last October, do they tighten restrictions against China? Do they ask the Dutch and the Japanese to tighten their own restrictions to limit the Chinese access to additional equipment? Or do they try to deal with that unilaterally in a move that could be seen as extraterritorial bullying?
Mackenzie, one of the things, and this is why I like to take a step back, and the reason Huawei, though, has been in the crosshairs, it's because I think people are listening like, why shouldn't this Chinese company be able to do what it wants, right? We American companies get to do what they want to do on a global scale. The concern is the connection, right, with the Chinese government and the possibility of spying. Like, there's something deeper here, and that's why Huawei has so much been on the radar, certainly of U.S. officials.
That's right. I mean, Huawei was put on the U.S. entity list, which is basically a watch list of we need to regulate the trade with this company in 2019. And certainly its ties to the Chinese government are of significant concern to the U.S. It's not a state-owned company, but it is one that has enjoyed significant state support.
All right, just so that there's some perspective. What I also find is interesting is that when it comes to the U.S. and its allies, I mean, it's also a competitive race, right, among all these technology companies to be able to sell their equipment. And so it's not necessarily so easy for other countries to maybe want to go along with the United States on this.
Of course. ASML, which is the chip-making equipment company in the Netherlands that produces the most advanced machines in the world, that's the most valuable tech company in Europe and kind of the prized possession of Amsterdam. And on the U.S. side, where U.S. companies have faced more significant restrictions than Japanese or Dutch chip equipment makers, those companies are angry at the Biden administration saying, hey, you're cutting us off from revenue opportunities in China, and our competitors are not facing the same thing.